Good morning, comrades. I've been asked to say a few words about restoring devolved government in the present situation. I think probably from the outset it's worth reminding ourselves that as far back as 1972, when the old Stormont administration was abolished, we opposed the abolition of Stormont because we viewed direct rule from Westminster as being a worse state of affairs than that which existed. But we are a very strongly devolutionist party. We've always believed in a local assembly in Northern Ireland, not just because we believe that that is the best means possible of addressing all of the social and economic problems which we face, but also because it's absolutely essential to our political programme of building socialism. It is absolutely necessary to create the public and political space in which to develop class consciousness, in which to highlight the contradictions which exist within our society, and for us to put forward our socialist programme. So it is absolutely essential that we do have devolved government restored, and there are a number of reasons for that, as I say. This morning Trevor pointed out the problems confronting the question of homelessness, and the fact that there are some programmes which would go some way to mitigating the problem of homelessness, but which can't be progressed because of the absence of an executive and assembly, the absence of budgets to enable those programmes to be implemented. And Ursula too pointed out the problems associated with childcare. The facts are that in England and Wales there are 30 hours a week available for childcare provided by the state. We don't have anything like that here in Northern Ireland. If we did have an assembly, it is possible that is something that we could progress through there as well. And on the other level, which we'll talk about a wee bit as well, Oisin also raised the fact that even when we did have the assembly in existence, it didn't always take progressive decisions. And in fact, the assembly, when it was in existence, has failed to develop progressive policies in many areas, not least towards the eradication of sectarianism, the promotion of greater integration within Northern Ireland society, and in particular integrated education. So we may come back to some of those points in a few moments as well. But the present situation is that we don't have an assembly and an executive in place because of the DUP position of refusing to take up their positions. Now, it is important for points of clarity to state a couple of things. I'm not here to defend the DUP, and in fact I'm going to be very highly critical of them in some of the comments that I'm making. But this isn't a veto by the DUP. This is inherent in the Good Friday Agreement. And it was one of the criticisms which we made about the agreement at the time, was that it in fact would lead to the institutionalisation of sectarianism, that it was built on the basis of there being two distinct communities in Northern Ireland. And Sinn Féin exercised the same right themselves too, when they refused to enter into the executive for 3 years until they got an Irish Language Act. So what the DUP are in fact doing is quite legitimate under the rules of the Good Friday Agreement, because the rules of the Good Friday Agreement state that an executive cannot be formed without the participation of the Nationalist Party and without the participation of the Unionist Party. So it's worth bearing in mind that there are aspects of the Good Friday Agreement which were not so good and which we highlighted at the time, and which are directly contributing to the paralysis which we're now faced. But we are where we are, and how do we get out of this situation? It is absolutely imperative, as I say, that we do have the assembly restored. Is there any prospect of that happening? Well, based on the events of this week, the prospects at one level look very bleak. We had the Windsor House agreement and we'll say a few things about that also. But this week in Parliament in Westminster, the DUP MPs voted against the Windsor House Agreement, which in some ways was not surprising, but probably what was more surprising was the conviction and the force with which Jeffrey Donaldson stated that the DUP would not be going back into the executive anytime soon. Now that's a wee bit of a puzzling situation, because Jeffrey appears to be running a parallel strategy. Because whilst they voted against this at Westminster, you will remember that 2 or 3 weeks ago as well, Jeffrey took the step of creating a unionist task force within the DUP led by Peter Robinson to examine the whole issue of the Windsor House Agreement and where it left unionism. Now, I can only but speculate that there's a reason for everything, and that the only reason this body was formed at all was to provide Jeffrey with some cover for reaching some sort of get out from the predicament which he now finds himself in. That task force is due to report by next Friday, and I can't see that it is simply going to replicate what the Westminster MPs have done in terms of saying, no, we're just totally rejecting the Windsor House Agreement and we're not going back into the Assembly. Why bother establishing it in the first place at all, if that's all it is going to do? But what may be possible is that they could come out and say, yes, we reject the Windsor House Agreement in its entirety and we don't agree with it, but in the interest of unionism strategically and looking into the future, we believe that it is better for unionism to go back into the executive. So they could well go back into the executive but still maintain their opposition to the Windsor House Agreement. That will not be a unanimous position, of course, because there are still elements within unionism, notably the TUV led by Jim Allister, but also importantly people within the DUP itself, like Sammy Wilson and Ian Paisley Jr., who I would suggest, no matter what happens about the protocol, would still maintain their opposition and don't want to enter into an executive in any situation at all. So it may well be that Jeffrey Donaldson has decided that at some point these critics within the DUP, and I think it is very clear that there is huge differences within the DUP. Personally, I believe that Jeffrey Donaldson and most of the DUP MLAs believe in devolution and do want the executive and the Assembly back. But it is the Westminster MPs, largely led by Sammy Wilson and Ian Paisley Jr., who do not and have always been vehemently opposed to the Good Friday Agreement and are now using this opportunity to withdraw support for that. So it may well be that Jeffrey has decided that at some point these people will have to be confronted. And there are council elections coming up just in a few weeks' time as well. And it may well be that he has decided that it's easier to take the hit at these council elections and build from there into the future, rather than an Assembly election where the loss of Assembly seats could have far greater consequences than maybe the loss of some council seats. So, as I say, I don't have any inside knowledge of any of this, but I just cannot understand why there would have been the establishment of this group of people led by Peter Robinson if it was not to provide some sort of escape route for Jeffrey Donaldson to enable the DUP to go back into the Assembly. But as I say, it won't be without a price. There will be casualties because people like Jim Allister, I think, are using this as a proxy means of preventing any return to the Stormont Assembly under any circumstances. The Windsor House Agreement does represent substantial progress in terms of mitigating the worst aspects of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And again, it's worth remembering that almost all the other political parties said and called at the time of the protocol for full and rigorous implementation of the protocol. And we heard all these voices as well saying that there could never be any renegotiation of the protocol, and that all these issues of technical ways of ensuring that there could be the free flow of trade between Britain and Northern Ireland, that no such technical solutions existed and so on. Well, they have all been proven wrong, because the European Union has come back and has changed its position on nearly all of these issues, and the Windsor House Agreement probably does represent a plus for Northern Ireland in terms of its economy and in terms of how it can do business in the future, both with the European Union and within the UK. And we have heard many business people, and of course business people will always make their voices heard when it matters, say that the Windsor House Agreement represents the best possible opportunity for Northern Ireland, because we get the best of both worlds. Now, whether workers get the best of both worlds or not remains to be seen, but I think we all know the answer to that one. So there is pressure, I think, for the return of the Assembly. It possibly may come, but it will be at a cost to the DUP in terms of the fact that it will have to confront those elements of unionism who will, under no circumstances, want a return to the Assembly and to the Executive. It's worth pointing out as well, I think, that some of the arguments which people like Jim Allister are making about the protocol and the extent to which it separates Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK, the issue of sovereignty and so on. Well, I think in that respect it's a bit like dancing on the head of a pin, and I'm loath to, with a couple of legal people here, but it seems that really what they're discussing are obscure points of law relating back to the 1801 Act of Union, which really don't have a significant impact upon day-to-day life here. In any event, it was never the case that Northern Ireland was exactly the same as the rest of the UK. It never was from the foundation of the Northern Ireland state. We had our own parliament here, we had our own Senate here, we had our governor, none of which existed in England, Scotland or Wales. And certainly in terms of social legislation, the DUP were very silent when we had different legislation here in relation to issues like divorce, gay rights, women's reproductive rights, all of these things. So, there are many examples of where Northern Ireland has always been different from the rest of the UK. And even in terms of the movement of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, we have always, for example, had veterinary checks on the movement of livestock from Liverpool to Belfast, for example. Those checks have always taken place. So, I think really what people like Jim Allister are attempting to do is to fight a rearguard action against the Assembly itself by means of using the protocol argument as a proxy to achieve that. So I think it is essential that we have a return to an Assembly. Whether that happens, as I say, remains to be seen. We won't have long to wait, because I think by next Friday, Jeffrey said that this task force would report back by the end of the month. So we will have a decision one way or another. But as I say, the way out could well be that the DUP will maintain its opposition to the Windsor House Agreement, but say that having consulted within unionism about the way forward, that the best practical means for unionism at this point in time is to go back into the Assembly, and that's what possibly will happen. Now, however, as I said, both Ursula and Trevor pointed out this morning examples of things that could be done within the Assembly which will help mitigate against the worst aspects of some of the problems which we confront, or even in some way progressively develop in areas like homelessness or childcare. But at the same time too, can we really honestly say that if the Executive and the Assembly were back in place tomorrow morning, that all of our problems in relation to homelessness, the health service, which would be key to hear what Lily has to say about that in a moment, education, that all of those problems would be solved if we had the Assembly back. I have to say that I'm very sceptical about that, because in the time that the Assembly and the Executive was in existence, the mainstream political parties failed to address any of these issues. And I want to maybe just introduce the Scottish example into this as well. Up until quite recently, it looked as though nothing could go wrong for the Scottish National Party. And suddenly within the SNP, the wheels seem to be falling off the wagon. But behind all of the internal intrigue that is going on there, it is a fact that part of the dissatisfaction with the SNP in Scotland has been that the SNP in Scotland has been virtually in power unchallenged for the last 20 years or so. And the powers which the local Scottish Parliament have are far greater than any powers which the local Assembly in Northern Ireland here have. And yet, even under the SNP leadership, education bumped standards right all the way down. The drug problem in Scotland hugely increased over the last 15 years or so. Homelessness and housing failure by the SNP again. On all of the social and economic indicators, the situation in Scotland has actually got far worse under devolved rule by the SNP. Now, why is that? Is it because the devolution itself is wrong, or is it because the policies being pursued by the SNP were wrong? I would suggest it's because the policies being pursued by the SNP were wrong. And we might have a little parallel here with our own local parties, the DUP and Sinn Féin. Like those two parties, the SNP has been obsessed with the question of independence and the constitutional issue. Here we have Sinn Féin constantly promoting at the moment a border poll, and the DUP constantly fighting rearguard action on the constitutional issue as well. And at the same time as all of that is happening, we don't have any addressing of the real problems which working class people are confronted with in their everyday lives. So, you know, that's just something which I think is worth bearing in mind. And I think it was Owen who raised the issue of the class nature of politics, and the fact that if an assembly and an executive is in existence, we need to focus far more on the actual policies and strategies which are being employed, rather than just the very existence of the assembly for its own sake. So I would say that if I were a betting man, I would say that the assembly is likely to come back. It may not be in the way in which we envisage that it would, but it is likely to come back, because for unionism in particular, there is no other show in town. And even as an act of self-preservation for unionism, they have learnt one lesson, I think, and that is that they cannot trust UK governments, or they cannot rely on friends at Westminster to secure their position. There is a huge body of opinion within unionism which is of the view that only unionists themselves can determine their own future. So I think that on that basis that the Assembly will return, but I think that we need to be far more critical of just what it is that we expect from an Assembly. And I suppose the bottom line is that what we need is a strong socialist programme promoted by a party like the Workers' Party, in order that if there is an Assembly, that it actually does promote and deliver real change in people's lives, and not just be there for the sake of being there. Thanks, comments.